what do you think of when you think of a science class? Maybe you think of a textbook filled with lots of facts, very dense. What do you think of when you think of a scientist? Maybe you think of a crazy-headed physicist scribbling notes on the blackboard, or a chemist like this one, and we can all acknowledge that none of our colleagues in either the physics or chemistry departments look like this. But what do I think of when I think of a scientist? I think of somebody asking questions, doing experiments, probably in a lab coat, but if you're like me, maybe wearing a floppy hat and boots instead out at my field sites. What I think a scientist is somebody who is asking questions, who is taking that fact-based, that information, and using them to look at the world in a new way. And yet, not very often in our science classes do we actually teach our students how to have the creative thinking, the flexible thinking, and the open minds in order to be able to see the world in a way that's different from how everybody else thinks. So I'm going to talk today about how I assign books in my science classes that you don't ordinarily see assigned. One a memoir and one a work of fiction, as a way to help teach our students how to have those open minds and to see the world in a different way. The first book is the highly acclaimed memoir by Dr. Hope Jahren called Lab Girl. In this book, Dr. Jahren describes her path towards becoming an academic, starting tinkering in her father's high school physics laboratory, and then on to graduate school, and establishing her own lab. Now, this was far from a straight path for her. She had obstacles from ones that were put in place by institutional sources, but also hurdles that she faced with her own mental health issues. But throughout all of these discussions, Dr. Jahren is open, honest, and often very funny. So the class that I assign this to is a biology department class, mostly juniors and seniors in taking a class called plant ecology. And so it's your typical science class, couple lectures a week with a once-a-week laboratory experiential experience where they're going to collect data, analyze it, write lab reports, and so forth. We read Lab Girl throughout the term, and about every 2 weeks we discuss it, and I curate questions for the students to discuss in small groups, and then open it up to discussion in a larger format. I don't test the material on exams. The discussions are the point. And what we wind up getting out of it is the ability to wind up learning more than what we're learning in those textbooks and so forth. So I think that the reason that it works is for several reasons. One is that Dr. Jahren has a gift for science communication, and she is able to explain how plants work, how they're interacting with their environment, and how they're interacting with each other in a way that grabs anybody's attention, from me as a professional scientist, to my students, to somebody who's not a scientist at all, like my mom or dad. She's able to explain what she thinks when she looks at a tree, or when she looks at a landscape, the how and the why, and the excitement that she has when she asks questions, and how she thinks about those questions in a way that's infectious. She teaches the students that scientific discoveries aren't tablets that we find on the ground, that they're a product of observation and thinking, and yes, creativity in order to be able to look at the world in a different way. And she describes all of those thought processes that she has. And she also makes clear that most scientific discoveries aren't made by geniuses. They're made by just about anybody who follows those processes. And so as a result, my students can wind up not only seeing what real science is like, but they can also see themselves doing it as well. My students wind up really enjoying reading this as an alternative to, or as an additional textbook reading for besides just their textbook. They wind up explaining how Lab Girl lets them not only understand plant ecology more deeply, but also science more deeply. And they're also able to place what, let's admit, is a fairly arcane subject in many ways into their own lives. And you can see some of the quotes here, and my favorite one is on the lower right there from the student who said that she thought that Dr. Jaren's explanations of plants were poetic and beautiful, and that she would reread passages and then think about them later when walking around looking at plants. And I can't think of something that made me happier when I read a student explanation than that. What this did was it wound up giving them the ability to really see the world in a different way, and that was very much my goal. The second book is very different from Lab Girl. The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future by the historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway is a work of future fiction. And I assigned this book to my Introduction to Environmental Science class, where we talk about climate change a lot. In this book, the narrator, writing from the year 2393, looks back and tries to explain how previous generations, our generation, failed to enact the, to her, very obvious policies to do something about climate change. She goes on to explain how famine, mass migrations, and the collapse of Western democracies wound up leading to a world where essentially the world now was ruled by autocratic governments akin to today's China. The better to be able to deal with the upheavals that the new world and the new climate had wrought. When we're thinking about something as grand and as impactful as climate change, it can be very difficult to move beyond the facts, the graphs, and even the projections from organizations like the United Nations to really understand what our future is going to hold. And I put myself in that place too, even though I knew all those facts and I knew the UN's projections. I had trouble really picturing a world that was different from my own. But fiction is one of the most effective ways for us to be able to understand a world different from our own. It worked for me after I read Collapse. And it worked for my students as well. They came to realize what a tremendous threat climate change is for them, for their own lives, saying, this book made me realize, it grabbed my attention and made me think a lot about the consequences of climate change and gave me an idea about what life would be like if we don't do anything. Now, I'm not telling you anything that my humanities colleagues haven't known for a long time, that art and literature can be very effective in teaching creativity. And sometimes we call this STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. But not often enough do we scientists wind up incorporating these lessons of creativity into our own classes within the context of our own disciplines. We assume that at a liberal arts institution like Union, if students are taking classes in science and social sciences and the humanities over the course of their 4 years, that they're going to get that creativity. But the fact is, if we can do more within our classes, then we're going to make better scientists. So I'm exploring ways in which I can expand upon this, to have the students interact with poetry and landscape and even making art. All ways that I hope that they can have more open minds to the questions that a scientist needs and be able to see worlds different from the ones that they actually experience. And that way they're going to really be able to understand their world better and ultimately to be able to change the world. Thank you very much.